Now lately on YouTube I've noticed there have been a few videos uploaded comparing UK and US gun laws, and most of them state and go into detail about the Dunblane shootings being one of the reasons why UK gun laws were tightened up a few years ago. And it got me thinking, there was a disaster years ago in 1966 that killed 116 children and 20 odd adults. Now, those children were between 7 and 10. So now those children, if they had lived, would be a year or two younger than me. But they were robbed of a life that I've had. And it really struck home at the time. But I've spoken to people recently and in the past who have never heard of Aberfan. And it was massive. It was an awful, awful thing. So I thought I'd put a video up about it. I don't want anybody to think that I'm like disrespecting it. It's very poignant and absolutely not. This is done out of complete respect for the people who lost their lives, for those 100 and odd lives. That generation of a village's people, children, gone. The MCB were in some way culpable. And what I've done, I've got two videos and I've edited them together. I hope the people who I've taken them off, one of them, Simon, the lad with the beard, does fabulous podcasts, fabulous videos on the, he has a brilliant channel. You want to go and have a look at it, it's amazing, he's fabulous. And I've edited them together because they get a little bit political, and I don't want to go down that road. I'm not starting pointing the finger at anybody. I don't want to go down that road. So I just wanted to basically to bring it to people's attention because it's been forgotten. People, anybody born after the 70s probably have never heard of Aberfan. And that's criminal. It was devastating. I remember watching this on the television when I was 12 years old. And the kids there were 10 years old. We watched it the same day as it all unfolded. It's horrible. Anyway, I've put the links to the original videos in the description. I've taken out, I've edited them quite long, both of them were quite long videos. I've edited them down because I don't want it to get political. It could do, and I totally agree with the sentiments. And you will get a gist of that from what I've left in just a little bit, but I do agree with those sentiments. But just watch it. When you've watched it, just think. The people involved would have been in the 60s now. My mother's still alive, so that means that the chances are that there are some of the parents of the children who lost their lives who are still alive.
On the morning of the 21st of October 1966, children filed noisily into the Victorian red brick Pantglas Junior School in the small Welsh village of Aberfan. Despite the dreary weather, there was an air of excitement. It was the last day before half-term, and considering it was only a half-day, the children knew they would be free in just a few hours. It was a soggy day, the kind of persistent heavy rain you typically get in this Welsh valley area that leaves a dense fog clinging to the hills and creeping through the village. One by one, the children took their seats, and eventually, teachers throughout the school began taking the morning register.
In Aberfan, as Gaynor Madgwick knows only too well, the past is never far away. From the distinct white arches of the hillside cemetery, where her brother and sister lie buried, both dead before the age of 11, to the mountain above, where it all began.
Shortly after 9:15 a.m., a low rumble could be heard, later described as sounding like a low-flying jet or thunder. The sound gained in volume over the coming seconds, building to a deafening roar as lights in the school started flickering. Some rushed to the windows to look out, but it was too late. One of Britain's worst disasters was now unfolding, which would eventually take the lives of 144 people, 116 of whom were children. It was a catastrophe of surreal proportions, and one which has left painful memories ever since.
When I turned to look out of the window and run, because I knew something was coming, but you just can't imagine what, I just seen black. It was literally black coming through the window, and then it was almighty silence.
By 1966, 7 spoil heaps had accumulated, adding up to an estimated 2 million cubic meters, that's 2.6 million cubic yards, which would be enough to fill 80% of the Great Pyramid of Giza. All of this lay just above the village, but only one tip was still in use, number 7, which had reached a height of 34 meters, 111 feet, and contained around 227,000 cubic meters of spoil, enough to fill the Royal Albert Hall 2.5 times. But importantly, this tip also included 23,000 cubic meters of tailings, fine particles of coal and ash that tend to take the form of quicksand when wet. No doubt some of you are watching this right now with incredulity. How on earth was the coal industry allowed to heap so much spoil directly above a small village? But this was very much how things had been done for a long time. And if the NCB thought that looming mounds of spoil above Aberfan weren't a danger, well, then that was essentially that. It's also important to remember that for this community, the mine was everything. If the mine closed, the village would suffer horribly. How much was ever explicitly said, we don't know, but NCB had certainly fostered a situation where complaints wouldn't necessarily be levied at the organisation out of fear that the mine would close in retaliation. Stuck between a rock and a hard place is probably the best way of looking at it. But there was another problem, one that would be pivotal to the entire disaster and which would never be entirely explained away. Tips 4, 5 and 7 had been placed above streams or springs, which had been included on Ordnance Survey maps for well over 100 years, so it was certainly known by those at the colliery. Tip 7 had actually slipped just slightly 3 years before when a crater appeared at the top of the pile, but the NTB had dismissed the possibility that the village could be at risk, although they did stop dumping tailings into Tip 7. There were several cruel twists of fate that meant the Aberfan disaster played out as it did. Had it occurred just a few hours earlier or later, the Pantglas Junior School would have been empty. In fact, with the school set to be closed the following week, it was the absolute worst time that anything could have happened. The 3 weeks leading up to the disaster had seen consistent heavy rainfall, with 170 millimeters, that's 6.5 inches, falling, half of which came in the 3rd week alone. On the night of the 20th of October, a large shift in Tip 7 saw it collapse by 2.7 to 3 meters, that's 9 to 10 feet, with some of the rails used to transport the spoils falling into the hole created at the top. When the morning's shift arrived at 7:30 a.m, an assessment of Tip 7 was carried out and deemed safe, although it was decided that a new tipping location would need to be found shortly. With that settled, those working on the heaps went about their business. At 9:15 a.m, the grounds began to move. Those who witnessed it have described it as a black avalanche as the spoil first collapsed in on itself and then shot out from the bottom in waves, travelling at 18 to 34 kilometers an hour or 11 to 21 miles per hour, with each crest reaching 6 to 9 meters, that's 20 to 30 feet in height. There was no time to raise the alarm, and even if there had been, somebody had stolen the cable for the telephones up on the mounds. Those down in the village on the western side around the Moy Road area had little hope as the black tsunami barreled downhill, picking up terrifying speed as it went. The first wave crashed into the 2 cottages on the outskirts of the village, killing those inside instantly before cascading into Aberfan itself, ripping apart 2 water mains, which exacerbated the catastrophe even more. The rows of terraced houses on Moy Road were obliterated by the powerful spoil surge, which then slammed into the school. 240 children were present inside, and for them, everything went black.
People poured into Aberfan to help, as parents looked on, desperate for news.
We had a little girl out, she must have been about 5. She was just crying and asking to go home when we got her out, you know. And we felt that you could have cried for her and all, you know.
One girl buried under the debris for nearly 2 hours that morning was 7-year-old Karen Thomas.
Everything just caved in on top of us, and we were in darkness, we couldn't move. We were calling for the dinner lady, but she wasn't speaking to us. But my fingertips could just touch her hair, and I remember trying to pull her hair, but there was no response off her at all. So it was just us, just crying and screaming.
Karen was saved by an air pocket, the result, she thinks, of the dinner lady's initial efforts to shield her.
Do you think about her?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I haven't told anybody up until now, but I go to the cemetery to put flowers on her. That's the only way that I can say thank you to her.
Eyewitnesses in the vicinity described the eerie silence once the black avalanche came to rest. Before the sirens exploded and the wailing of the colliery alarm began, a horrifying stillness hung in the air. There were no immediate cries. Even the birds seemed to hold their tongues. One person described it as if nature had realized that a tremendous mistake had been made, and nature was speechless. Within minutes, local residents began arriving at the school and were confronted with a scene of utter horror. The spoil had filled 4 classrooms, burying those that had been at their tables just moments earlier, and in another tragic twist, the tailings that had been in Tip 7 began mixing with water to create a cement-like concoction. Those first on the scene began digging frantically with household tools, and at exactly 9:25 a.m. the first phone call arrived at the police station. The unknown caller said quickly, "I have been asked to inform that there has been a landslide at Pantglass. The tip has come down on the school." 20 minutes after the accident, miners began streaming down from the colliery and immediately started directing rescue efforts, which were still hampered by the burst water mains that meant the slip continued to move through the village. It's estimated that around 9 to 14 million litres, 2 to 3 million gallons of water poured out as rescue efforts got underway. It wasn't until 11:30 a.m. that the water was finally turned off, and by that point, those who had come out from the school alive had already done so. It was a frantic scene, with hundreds digging into the hardened spoil. By this point, the group included firefighters, police, medics, the army, civil defence, and miners from surrounding pits. A whistle would blow at short intervals, and those desperately searching would pause for a few seconds, hoping with fading desperation that sounds could still be heard from within the school.
Karen and Gaynor would be rescued, but 144 people died that day, 116 of them children. Most pupils aged between 7 and 10. A story of the coal board who tried hard to evade blame for the disaster their ineptitude created. A story of catastrophe compounded by injustice.
A total of 144 lost their lives, ranging in age from 3 months to 82 years. 116 of those killed were children, most aged between 7 and 10.
The scar tissue of Aberfan is still healing. Karen still suffers debilitating nightmares. But the sense of community, of a bond forged in grief and then nurtured tenderly over 50 years, is clear.
There'll always be a bond in Aberfan, especially amongst our generation, that the ones that are still there, you know, and I think we'll all still be close to each other, because whenever we see each other, we do, you know, make a fuss of each other.
Some here have never spoken publicly about what happened until now. Some still can't. In Aberfan, the impact of that terrible morning, half a century on, remains profound.
Inexplicably, the NCB has never been held accountable for what happened in Aberfan. During the 76-day tribunal, they first argued that it was an act of God for which they couldn't be blamed, heavy rain and geological factors. But in a dramatic U-turn, perhaps because things were beginning to look a little dicey, the NCB finally acknowledged its role in the disaster and the effect the streams and springs had had on the Spall Mounds. The tribunal found that the accident was not the result of villainy, but was a terrifying tale of bungling ineptitude by many men charged with tasks for which they were totally unfitted, a failure to heed clear warnings, and of a total lack of direction from above. And yet not a single person was ever charged with a crime, and the NCB was never prosecuted. Nobody in the company lost their jobs or were even demoted. It was as if the disaster that caused 144 to lose their lives had never happened. The reason for this has never been fully explained, and no doubt lies within the murky underworld of governmental officers that sought not to take full responsibility while effectively spinning the disaster and creating a different narrative. For those involved with the Aberfan disaster, life was never the same again. There have been higher cases of premature death than usual among the survivors and their families, with suicide often the cause. In the year immediately after the accident, deaths among close relatives were 7 times higher than the national average. The effects of PTSD were also dramatic, particularly with the children that were pulled out from the school with sleeping difficulties, nervousness, lack of friends, unwillingness to go to school, and enuresis, all common among survivors. Some events come to define a place, and perhaps even a country, during a specific time, and for many, the horror of Aberfan is just that. It led to significant changes in how the coal industry worked, but this was always an industry on the decline, and the coming years for the region proved to be increasingly difficult. Today, the mine has long closed, and Aberfan is a quiet little rural village with a great deal of charm if you arrived without any knowledge of what happened. But it will also be a place that carries a dark, weighty secret.